Outlaw's widow sold her baby for bread. Then the buyer took off his mask. It was the preacher. She held her baby against her empty breast, knowing she had to choose between watching him starve or selling him to live. But when the buyer removed his mask, Sarah McKinnon discovered that sometimes salvation comes wearing the face of your greatest enemy. The blood had dried black against the saloon floor, but Sarah McKinnon could still smell her husband's death 3 days later. She pressed her face against the cracked window of their one-room shack, watching dust devils dance where Jeremiah had fallen to the bounty hunter's bullet. Her arms ached from holding baby Thomas. She'd named him after the saint, hoping God might notice. But the child's cries had grown weaker each day, matching the emptiness in her chest where milk should have been. Winter was coming early to Perdition Creek. Sarah could taste it in the wind that rattled the loose boards of their shelter, could see it in the way the townspeople hurried past her door without meeting her eyes. They'd tolerated Jeremiah McKinnon when he spent his stolen silver in their establishments, but his widow carried a different kind of currency, the worthless coin of association with the damned. She counted the last of their provisions with trembling fingers. 2 stale biscuits, a handful of dried beans, water that tasted of rust and broken promises. The baby stirred against her shoulder, his tiny fist opening and closing like he was reaching for something that would never come. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of motherhood pressing down like a stone on her chest. "Hush now," she whispered against his downy head, though her voice cracked on the words. "Mama's thinking," but thinking was a luxury she couldn't afford. The rent was due in 2 days, and Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that no amount of pleading would extend the deadline. The store owner refused her credit, crossing himself whenever she approached his counter as if poverty were contagious. Even the doctor had turned them away when the baby's breathing grew shallow, claiming his services were for decent folk. Sarah walked to the mirror above their washstand, a wedding gift from her mother, one of the few things Jeremiah hadn't sold or lost in poker games. Her reflection startled her. Hollow cheeks, eyes like bruises, skin the color of old paper. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. The baby whimpered, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She unwrapped him from the quilt her grandmother had sewn, studying his perfect fingers, the way his mouth moved in sleep as if he were tasting dreams. He deserved better than a mother who could offer nothing but empty hands and an outlaw surname. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his sleeping face. "I'm so sorry." The decision formed slowly, like frost spreading across glass. Sarah had heard the whispers in town. Women in desperate circumstances, children who disappeared in the night and reappeared in better homes with different names. It happened more often than anyone cared to admit, this commerce of desperation. She wrapped Thomas in her wedding dress, the white cotton now yellowed with time and tears. The fabric still smelled faintly of the orange blossoms she'd worn in her hair the day she'd pledged her life to Jeremiah McKinnon, back when love seemed stronger than the law. Now it would serve as swaddling clothes for a transaction that would hollow out whatever remained of her soul. The town square lay empty in the pre-dawn darkness, save for a few early risers heading to the mill. Sarah positioned herself near the well, where anyone with coins to spare might notice a woman holding a bundle. Her hand shook as she adjusted the baby's wrappings, trying to make him look as precious as he truly was. From the church steps, a figure watched her through the gloom. Reverend Thomas Ashford stood in the shadow of his sanctuary, his black coat making him nearly invisible against the wooden doors. Sarah had seen him there before, studying the town's sins from his elevated perch. He'd refused to baptize her son, claiming the child carried his father's corruption in his blood. Now his presence felt like judgment made manifest. The sun crept over the mountains, painting the dust golden and warm. Sarah's arms grew numb from holding the baby, but still she waited. A few townspeople passed, averting their eyes from the spectacle of her desperation. Some crossed themselves. Others simply walked faster. Then footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, heavy with purpose. A man in a dark coat and hood stopped before her, his face hidden in shadow. Silver coins caught the morning light in his gloved palm. more money than Sarah had seen in months. How much? His voice was rough, weathered by years and secrets. Sarah looked down at her son's peaceful face, memorizing the curve of his tiny nose, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks. She tried to speak, but found no words for the price of motherhood. The stranger waited with the patience of someone accustomed to difficult transactions. Around them, Perdition Creek began to wake, doors opening, smoke rising from chimneys, the ordinary sounds of life continuing despite the extraordinary moment unfolding by the well. Finally, Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Enough for bread. Enough to live. The coins changed hands with the weight of damnation. And as the hooded stranger reached for her son, Sarah wondered if some betrayals were too deep for even God to forgive. The baby's weight left her arms like a prayer leaving her lips. But as the stranger lifted the child to his chest, something shifted in the morning light, something that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about salvation and the men who claimed to carry it. The silver coins were still warm in her palm when the stranger's hood fell away, revealing the face of Reverend Thomas Ashford, the same man who had refused to baptize her son and condemned her husband from the pulpit, now holding her baby with trembling hands like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. The coins felt like ice against Sarah's palm, but the shock of recognition burned hotter than shame. Reverend Thomas Ashford stood before her with her son cradled against his chest, the hood of his dark coat fallen back to reveal a face she'd seen twisted in righteous anger from the pulpit every Sunday. The same mouth that had pronounced her husband damned now pressed gentle kisses to her baby's forehead. "You," Sarah breathed, the word cutting through the morning air like an accusation. "You bought my son." Thomas's eyes, gray as storm clouds, she noticed now, met hers with something that looked like grief. "His name will be Samuel," he said quietly. "Heard by God." The irony wasn't lost on her. This man who had refused to hear her pleas for baptism, who had turned his back when she'd begged for Christian charity, now claimed her child would be heard by the Almighty. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, the silver coins cutting into her palm. "You hypocrite," she whispered. "You sanctimonious—" Yes. The word stopped her cold. Thomas Ashford, the man who had never admitted fault from his pulpit, nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." The baby stirred in his arms, making soft sounds that weren't quite cries. Thomas looked down at the child with wonder, as if he held a miracle instead of a transaction. His large hands, weathered from years of carpentry before the calling found him, supported the tiny body with surprising gentleness. "Come with me," he said, not looking at Sarah. "Please." She wanted to refuse, to snatch her son back and damn the consequences. But the weight of the coins in her hand and the emptiness in her belly spoke louder than pride. She followed him across the square, past the judgmental windows of sleeping houses, toward the white clapboard church that had become her symbol of exclusion. The rectory sat behind the church like an afterthought, small and plain, and somehow lonelier than her shack had ever been. Thomas pushed open the door with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the baby. And Sarah stepped into a life she had never imagined. The rooms were sparse but clean. A table set for one, books stacked on shelves like silent congregants. A bed that looked slept in but not lived in. No photographs, no feminine touches, nothing to suggest warmth or laughter had ever graced these walls. Thomas moved to the kitchen and began preparing something with practiced efficiency. Goat's milk warmed over the stove, a clean cloth for feeding. Sarah watched him work, noting the way his hands shook slightly as he tested the temperature against his wrist. "My wife died 7 years ago," he said without preamble. "Consumption. She spent her last months cursing God for the children he never gave us." He lifted the baby higher, supporting his head with infinite care. "I thought it was his will. I thought barrenness was our burden to bear." The baby latched onto the cloth eagerly, milk running down his chin in pale streams. Thomas smiled, the first genuine expression Sarah had ever seen cross his face, and something shifted in her chest. "Why?" she asked. "Why refuse to baptize him if you wanted?" because I was afraid. The admission came out broken, like a confession torn from deep places. Afraid that if I blessed him, I'd want to keep him. Afraid that wanting him was proof of my own weakness. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I've spent 7 years preaching about God's mercy while showing none myself. Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of everything, hunger, exhaustion, the impossible situation, pressing down on her shoulders. So you bought him instead? Like cattle at market? No. Thomas's voice was firm. I saved him. And maybe he'll save me too. The baby finished feeding, and Thomas lifted him to his shoulder, patting his back with the careful rhythm of someone who had watched other fathers, studied the motions, dreamed of performing them himself. When Samuel, she couldn't think of him by any other name now, released a satisfied burp, Thomas laughed. Actually laughed, a sound so unexpected in these austere surroundings that Sarah felt her heart crack open just a little. I have a proposition, Thomas said, still swaying gently with the baby. Stay. Help me care for him. I'll pay you not much, but enough for food, for clothes, for dignity. As what? Your hired nurse. As his mother. The only mother he's ever known. Thomas met her eyes steadily. I may have paid for him, Sarah McKinnon, but you carried him, birthed him, loved him first. That bond, that's not something silver can buy. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour, calling the faithful to morning prayer. But inside the rectory, a different kind of service was beginning, one measured not in hymns and scripture, but in bottles warmed and diapers changed and the slow, careful rebuilding of broken hearts. Sarah looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in the preacher's arms, saw the way Thomas's whole body had relaxed into the role he'd been denied for so long, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. What will people say? She asked quietly. Thomas smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. Let them talk. God knows we've both given them plenty to discuss already. As the baby settled into sleep between them, Sarah realized that maybe redemption didn't always come wrapped in righteousness. Sometimes it wore the face of a lonely preacher learning what it meant to love. And sometimes it looked like a mother discovering that grace could be found in the most unexpected arrangements. For 3 days, Sarah McKinnon haunted the edges of town like a ghost, watching the preacher who bought her baby tend to the child with trembling devotion. But when fever struck little Samuel and his cries echoed through the church walls, the man who had condemned her husband came crawling back, begging the outlaw's widow to save the son he'd claimed as his own. The fever came in the night like a thief, stealing the color from Samuel's cheeks and replacing his contented sighs with ragged breathing that echoed through the rectory like a prayer gone wrong. Thomas paced the floor with the baby pressed against his chest, feeling helpless as the tiny body burned against his shirt. He'd sent Sarah away 3 days ago with enough coins for a room at the boarding house and a promise that she could visit whenever she wished. But pride, that old familiar sin, had kept him from calling for her when Samuel's appetite waned, when the child's eyes grew glassy and distant. Thomas Ashford had spent years proclaiming God's will from the pulpit. Surely he could tend to one small baby without help. Now, as Samuel's breathing grew shallow and his cry weakened to a whisper, Thomas understood the arrogance of his assumption. He was a preacher, not a father. He knew Scripture by heart, but couldn't tell the difference between a fever that would break and one that would take everything with it. The church bell was tolling midnight when Thomas finally swallowed what remained of his pride. He wrapped Samuel in the softest blanket he could find and stepped into the cool desert air, his feet carrying him toward the boarding house where Sarah McKinnon lay sleeping. Mrs. Patterson answered his frantic knocking with a scowl that deepened when she recognized him. Reverend Ashford? What in the Lord's name? Mrs. McKinnon. I need Mrs. McKinnon. The words tumbled out of him like a confession. Please. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs in a white cotton nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking more like the girl she'd been before outlaws and widowhood had carved lines around her eyes. When she saw the bundle in his arms, She was down the stairs and at his side before he could speak. "What's wrong?" Her hands were already reaching for Samuel, maternal instinct overriding everything else. "Fever. Since sunset. He won't eat, won't settle. I don't—" Thomas's voice cracked. "I don't know what to do." Sarah took the baby with practiced ease, her palm pressed to his forehead, her ear close to his mouth to listen to his breathing. In the lamplight of the boarding house parlor, she looked like a Madonna painted by a master who understood that holiness often wore the face of ordinary women doing extraordinary things. "Willow bark tea," she said, already moving toward the door. "Cool cloths. And prayer, if you got any left in you." They walked back to the rectory in silence, Sarah cradling Samuel against her chest, while Thomas carried the weight of his own inadequacy. Inside, she took command with quiet authority, sending him to boil water while she began undressing the baby with gentle efficiency. "He's burning up," she murmured, her voice thick with worry. "How long did you wait before coming for me?" Thomas stirred willow bark into the steaming pot, his hands shaking. "Too long. I thought I could manage alone." "Pride's a sin, preacher," Sarah said. But there was no judgment in her voice, even for men of God. She began sponging Samuel's tiny body with cool water, singing softly under her breath. A lullaby Thomas didn't recognize, something passed down from mother to daughter through generations of women who knew that sometimes love was the only medicine that mattered. The baby's cries gentled under her touch, and Thomas felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, settling into a chair beside the makeshift sickbed they'd arranged on the kitchen table. "My mother. Her mother before her." Sarah dipped the cloth again, her movements economical and sure. "Women learn these things, preacher. We have to." The night stretched long and anxious. They took turns holding Samuel, walking the floor when he fussed, forcing droplets of willow bark tea between his tiny lips. Thomas watched Sarah work and felt something shift inside him. Not desire, exactly, but recognition. Here was competence born of necessity, grace earned through suffering, holiness that had nothing to do with Sunday sermons and everything to do with steady hands in the dark hours. Near dawn, Samuel's fever broke. His breathing eased, his color returned. And when Sarah offered him milk-soaked cloth, he latched on with renewed hunger. Thomas slumped in his chair, exhaustion and relief warring in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I couldn't have. Without you, he might have." Sarah smoothed the baby's hair with gentle fingers. "He's strong, like his father." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight Thomas hadn't expected. Jeremiah McKinnon had been an outlaw, a man who lived by the gun and died by it. But he'd also been Samuel's father. And in acknowledging that, Sarah had acknowledged something Thomas had tried to forget, that this child carried two legacies, one of sin and one of love, braided together in ways that couldn't be separated. "Stay," Thomas said suddenly. "Not just tonight. Stay." Sarah looked up from the baby, her expression unreadable. "What are you asking?" "I don't know." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I only know that he needs you. That we both need you." Outside, the sun was rising over Perdition Creek, painting the sky in shades of redemption. Sarah McKinnon, the outlaw's widow, looked at Thomas Ashford, the preacher who'd bought her son, and saw something she'd never expected to find in the rigid lines of his face. Humility. And maybe, if she was being honest, something that looked like the beginning of love. "All right," she said softly. "I'll stay." Samuel stirred in her arms, his tiny fist uncurling like a flower opening to the light. And in that moment, Thomas understood that grace didn't always arrive in churches or through Scripture. Sometimes it came in the form of a woman who knew how to heal what was broken, who could teach a preacher that mercy was more than just a word in the good book. Sometimes it looked exactly like this, two broken people learning to be whole again, one fevered night at a time. As Sarah settled into the chair beside Samuel's makeshift bed, her presence filling spaces in the rectory that had been empty for too long, Thomas wondered if God hadn't been working all along, using their individual failures to create something neither of them could have imagined, a family born not of blood or law, but of need transformed into love. The town council threatened to take Samuel away from the preacher because an unmarried man couldn't raise a child. But when Sarah McKinnon stood up in that stuffy meeting room and declared she'd marry Thomas Ashford to keep her son, she discovered that sometimes the most sacred vows are spoken not for love, but for something far more powerful, the fierce protection of a mother's heart. Autumn surrendered to winter's grip with the suddenness of a broken promise. But with it came the knock on the rectory door that Thomas had been dreading. Mayor Hutchins stood on the threshold with two other council members, their faces carved from the same righteous stone that had once graced Thomas's own pulpit demeanor. Reverend Ashford, Hutchins began, his voice carrying the weight of official business. We need to discuss the situation with the child. Thomas held Samuel closer, the boy now 3 months old and thriving under Sarah's constant care. She stood behind him in the doorway, her presence both protective and defiant. In the weeks since the fever, she had transformed the sterile rectory into something resembling a home. Wildflowers in mason jars, baby clothes drying by the fire, the sound of lullabies floating through rooms that had known only silence for too long. What situation would that be? Thomas asked, though he knew. The whispers had grown louder, the sideways glances more pointed. A bachelor preacher raising a baby with the help of an outlaw's widow. Perdition Creek's gossip mill had been grinding overtime. An unmarried man cannot properly raise a child. Councilman Bradley interjected, his thin lips pressed into a line of moral certainty. It's unseemly. Unnatural. The boy needs a proper Christian home. The Weatherbys have expressed interest, Hutchins added. Good people. Church-going folk. They could provide stability, respectability, no. Sarah's voice cut through their proclamations like a blade. She stepped beside Thomas, her chin lifted in challenge. You will not take my son. Your son. Bradley's eyebrows rose. I was under the impression you sold the child for bread money. Surely you forfeited any claim. I forfeited nothing. Sarah's voice trembled with barely controlled fury. I made an impossible choice to save his life. But Samuel is mine, and I will die before I let you hand him over to strangers. Thomas watched her fierce defense of their boy, for Samuel had become theirs in ways that transcended law or biology, and felt something settle into place in his chest. These months of shared midnight feedings, of teaching Sarah to read scripture while she taught him the secret language of infant needs, of building a life from the broken pieces of their separate griefs, had shown him what he'd been missing all those years of preaching about love without understanding it. There is a solution, Thomas said quietly, his decision crystallizing like frost on glass. Mrs. McKinnon and I could marry. The silence that followed his words was profound. Sarah turned to stare at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. The council members shifted uncomfortably, their righteous certainty suddenly on less solid ground. Marriage of convenience is hardly, Bradley began. Marriage is marriage in the eyes of God, Thomas interrupted. Would you question the sanctity of vows spoken before him? Hutchins cleared his throat. The town would need assurance that this is a proper union, not merely a legal arrangement to circumvent our concerns. The town will get what it deserves, Sarah said coolly. Respectability. A preacher's wife. A child raised in the church. What more could you possibly want? The council members exchanged glances, their moral objections crumbling before practical considerations. A scandal resolved through matrimony was preferable to the ongoing gossip that had been disrupting their orderly community. They left with grudging acceptance and the promise to monitor the situation closely. When the door closed behind them, Sarah and Thomas stood facing each other in the sudden quiet, Samuel babbling contentedly between them. The weight of the commitment they'd just made settled around them like dust after a windstorm. Did you mean it? Sarah asked softly. Or was it just words to keep them away? Thomas looked at her, this woman who had taught him that grace could wear work-worn hands and carry the scent of baby's milk, who had shown him that holiness was less about sermons and more about showing up when someone needed you most. I meant it. Every word. We barely know each other. I know you sing to Samuel when you think no one's listening. I know you read scripture with your finger tracing each word because you taught yourself from a stolen Bible. I know you'd walk through fire for this boy. Thomas reached out, his fingers finding hers. I know you've made me a better man than I ever was in the pulpit. Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. I know you gave up your reputation to save my son. I know you make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and you read bedtime stories even though Samuel can't understand a word. I know you've never once made me feel less than worthy of kindness. Then we know enough. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning with only Samuel as witness, his tiny hands reaching for the dust motes dancing in the stained glass light. Thomas spoke his vows in the same voice he'd once used to condemn, now soft with something deeper than duty. Sarah promised to love and honor him with the same fierce protectiveness she'd shown their son, understanding that sometimes love grew from shared purpose rather than passion. As winter deepened, their unusual family found its rhythm. Sarah took over the church's charity work, her own experience with desperation making her uniquely qualified to recognize need in others. Thomas discovered that his sermons carried new weight when they came from a man who understood both failure and redemption firsthand. Samuel grew strong on his mother's milk and his father's newfound gentleness, oblivious to the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. One evening, as snow fell outside their windows and Samuel slept peacefully in his crib, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire, sharing the silence that had become comfortable between them. She was mending one of his shirts. He was preparing Sunday's sermon, and the domesticity of it felt like a miracle neither had dared hope for. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The choices that brought us here?" Thomas set down his pen and looked at her, really looked, noting the way contentment had softened the sharp edges that hunger and grief had carved around her eyes. "I regret that it took us so long to find each other. I regret that Samuel will never know his birth father. But regret marrying you? Regret this?" He gestured to encompass their small world. "Never." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face completely. "Good. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Thomas Ashford. And that wasn't part of our arrangement." "No," Thomas agreed, reaching for her hand. "It wasn't. But then the best gifts rarely are." Outside, Perdition Creek slept under its blanket of snow, unaware that in the modest rectory behind the white church, a family born of desperation had discovered that sometimes the bread that sustains you isn't what fills your belly, but what feeds your soul. And sometimes, when you think you're buying salvation, you discover you've been selling yourself short all along. The love they'd found wasn't the passionate romance of storybooks, but something more durable, built on shared midnight vigils and quiet conversations, on the trust that comes from seeing someone at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. It was love earned through service, sanctified through sacrifice, and blessed by a God who seemed to specialize in writing straight with crooked lines. In his crib, Samuel stirred and smiled in his sleep, dreaming perhaps of the lullabies that would carry him safely through the night, sung by a mother who had sold him for bread and found him again in grace, tended by a father who had bought him for loneliness and discovered in return the only congregation that had ever truly mattered. And as the snow continued to fall on Perdition Creek, covering the scars of their separate pasts with the promise of new beginnings, Thomas and Sarah understood that redemption rarely arrived as expected. Sometimes it wore the face of an outlaw's widow. Sometimes it carried the voice of a humble preacher. And sometimes it slept peacefully in a crib, proof that love could indeed multiply rather than divide, even when it began with the simple, desperate need for bread.